Hello and welcome to our webinar on biodiversity in real assets. I'm Louise Russell from Avora Global, where we help asset owners integrate sustainability, ESG, and now biodiversity into their portfolios in a way that actually drives decision making and long-term value. At Avora Global, we work with asset managers on strategy, reporting, and implementation. And what we've seen is that biodiversity is often where clients need deeper technical input. So we've partnered with RSK Nature Positive to bring that ecological depth to our real assets decision making. And I'm accompanied by Tom Mason from RSK. If you just want to quickly introduce yourself, Tom.
Thanks, Louise. I'm Tom Mason. I'm with RSK Nature Positive, and we help organizations to evaluate, understand, and act on their nature-related risks and opportunities and embed it into their asset management and supply chain strategies.
So biodiversity is a complex challenge. Different ecosystems, different impacts across asset types, and also a growing set of reporting requirements. And that's why we partnered with RSK Positive back in 2025. They bring to us, to the table, a deep ecological expertise, helping our clients understand what's happening on the ground, while we focus on translating that into practical strategies, reporting, and investment decisions. So today we're going to explore not just the drivers around why asset owners are looking to improve biodiversity credentials of their portfolio, but how it fits into real world investment strategies and how you can manage risk, unlock opportunities, and hopefully also integrate nature into your asset management. You're also going to hear some practical examples, a case study or two, and also lessons learned from work with clients across the real assets. So we're going to dive into that now, but before we do, we're going to pop up a poll just to get a temperature on the room and those who are attending. And if you could please just quickly answer, we'll move on then. Well, there definitely seems to be so investor stakeholder expectations is really, well, it's pretty much head to head with risk management and long-term asset value, which is interesting, both winning the stage here. Okay, that's great. That is interesting. It's pretty neck and neck, isn't it, around investor and risk management? We also will have a Q&A open today. If you navigate to the bottom of your screen, you can pop in questions that we will also try to respond to if we've got time at the end. If you navigate to the bottom, there should be three dots. If you click on those, it will pop out a window around that will show you Q&A, and you can just pop your question in there. Now, over to you, Tom. Tom's going to look a little bit at why. Why should it matter to you?
Stories. Yeah, the whole topic of nature and biodiversity is sort of where climate was about 10 years ago, and the polls speak for themselves. It's a topic that's largely been driven by the financial sector, and we're seeing, investors, asset managers, and the insurance companies are really starting to pay attention to nature and biodiversity as a key theme. And there's a few reasons. So first amongst that is risk resilience. So climate and nature related risks are interlinked entirely. Extreme weather, flooding, water scarcity. They're not abstract concerns anymore. They're directly affecting asset performance and they're directly affecting insurance costs. Last year, there was about a 14% increase in weather-related property claims. Payouts went up by about 32%, and there was a clear message from the insurance industry in regards to that is that we should stop building in high flood risk areas without also investing in substantial mitigations, both technological and nature-based. So if you think of it this way, nature loss is a direct financial risk. and nature positive strategies are a risk management tool. Now, second, there are real financial benefits. Louise will speak to these a little bit later on, whether it's cost efficiencies, green premiums, or access to green capital. Nature and biodiversity presents opportunities on top of, in addition to low carbon and net zero initiatives. Third, the reporting landscape is moving rapidly. So nature is now being embedded into mainstream disclosure frameworks at quite a pace. And this means that nature-related reporting is moving from being optional to becoming expected, and in the not too distant future, in certain jurisdictions, all indications point to it becoming mandatory. The market is standardizing expectations, and the direction of travel in this regard is quite clear. And last but by no means least, there is now a legal expectation that directors address nature as a material risk to the business. Assessing the organization's exposure to nature-related risks falls squarely under directors' oversight responsibilities. And this is not just an ESG obligation anymore, it's a governance obligation. So boards need to demonstrate that they understand how nature-related risks and opportunities can potentially or actually impact financial performance and long-term value creation. So as an asset manager or a portfolio manager, how do you actually get started on doing that? And importantly, how do you quickly prioritize relevant actions without breaking the bank with a full-blown environmental impact assessment? So a biodiversity footprint is a very ideal way to get started with that. And this is great because you can input the same data that you would normally use for a scope 1, 2, 3 carbon or GHG inventory assessment. And with a rapid evaluation, you can get, first of all, an identification of the relevant impacts of your operations from your asset. This is the inside-out materiality approach. So you can think about things like land conversion, pollution, light pollution, waste, water use. Second, you've got the outside-in view, which can identify to what extent your assets might be exposed to nature-related risks. This can include dependencies on ecosystems. So I spoke before about flood risks. This is a climate risk, but it is also a very location-specific nature-related risk. And you can heat map which assets within your portfolio, which operations within your organization are most exposed to these impacts and these risks. So whether it's an investment, whether it's an asset under your direct control, or whether it's a part of your supply chain, you can triage effectively and you can prioritize risk mitigation where it matters, whether that's operational interventions, procurement decisions, or supplier engagement. Louise.
Thanks, Tom. Now, is biodiversity just a cost item, or can there actually be some financial incentives associated with it? So one of the ones that we are seeing emerging is a green premium. So how assets can differentiate in a challenging market. There's been some research that's come out. So for instance, Knight Frank, their research team identified average rental premiums of 12.3% for buildings that had strong environmental credentials. Now, that was based on about 6,500 transactions over an 11-year period. In another study by the Office for National Statistics in the UK, they found that having a small functional green space or blue space within 200 meters of a property was associated with 0.5, 0.9% increase in actual property value, while being closer to an even larger green or blue space, actually they found rose prices by between 1.4 and 3.6%. Equally, green premiums, conversely, you can actually see a brown discount are some of the ways we're also seeing. So where there's a challenging market, those that aren't performing in line with maybe a more green or environmentally or biodiversity high profile asset are actually attracting potentially some brown discounts too. The other one is green buildings can have lower operational costs. So thinking specifically about biodiversity, you can put in place greener, cool roofs that can look to actually lower operational energy cooling costs for those buildings simply because they're attracting lower sunlight into the building than a typical, let's say, black roof. And then the last one is the access to financial incentives around green bonds or sustainability linked loans. One example was Hammersmith, for instance. They have a green bond of 815 million towards 8,000 new homes where there's going to be 50% affordable housing. And they were looking to have a reduction of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions against a 2020 baseline. Equally, we can see linked sustainability linked loans that have biodiversity goals also attached to those. Just half of the press is Norge Bank. So last week, Norge Bank, Norge Bank is a 2.1 trillion investment manager of Norway's sovereign wealth fund. They announced their nature expectations for their portfolio companies. And so their guidance sets out clear 8 expectations that will apply to all companies, ranging from board oversight to strategy integration and disclosure around target setting. It's very much looking at the TNFD guidelines that Tom will talk about shortly. And some of those key board expectations, they require ensuring that nature-related risks and opportunities are going to be identified and integrated into corporate strategy and risk management, and also that those same companies have policies in place to manage that. The companies are going to be expected to have targets that will set to address material nature impacts and dependencies with associated action plans as well to deliver on those targets. Norge Bank themselves, so they're planning to include this in their own existing corporate engagement activities. So, well, that might be voting on shareholder proposals, voting for the re-election of a board member, or potentially even divestment. So they have also indicated that where companies don't respond, they're going to put them forward as candidates for under risk-based divestment criteria for nature-related risks.
All right. Louise, you just mentioned TNFD, and I imagine many people on the call will be familiar with that acronym, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and it's really become the central framework that at the moment is guiding a lot of decision making from investors, from asset managers. It's a voluntary risk management and a voluntary disclosure framework. So TNFD is similar in spirit, in concept, to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But where TCFD focuses on climate, TNFD is encouraging the integration of climate and nature-related risk assessment, and to an extent, human rights. It helps organizations to identify, assess, and respond to nature-related risks as well as opportunities across all stages of an asset life cycle. And it does this through the LEAP framework. It's locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. That's a 4-step process to identifying, validating, and reporting risks and opportunities and setting targets. And that's meant to be done on an iterative basis. You don't do it all in one go. Most organizations will start with the locate and evaluate phase, quite simple, and then determine priorities and work towards targets and disclosures later down the line. And importantly, this provides a structure for integrating climate and nature into a single coherent disclosure. You don't have to do them separately. And there's sector-specific guidance for the real assets world as well. Adoption for real assets is accelerating fast, and actually for the framework as a total, we've now got over 760 companies which have publicly stated that they're going to be reporting against TNFD, a very high level of uptake across Europe and in Asia, a very high uptake in Japan. 10% of the total adopters are asset managers, and 15% are either in the business of real estate, infrastructure, utilities, energy, and construction. And the interoperability of TNFD is a major strength. So there's loads of acronyms floating around at the moment, but if you report against CSRD in Europe, GRESB, IFRS, CDP for your supply chain or your operations, or the Global Reporting Initiative, or any combination of those, TNFD can actually be the common link or the common framework to simplify all of your assessments and reporting. So it's not to be thought of as something extra, but it's something that can simplify a lot of what you already do. It is a substantial framework. It covers off corporate governance for nature-related risks, organizational strategy, risk management, and target setting. But the starting point is actually quite simple. You conduct a gap analysis as with any assessment. So with a TNFD gap analysis, you align your existing reporting and data capture to the TNFD framework. You won't be starting from scratch because you will have done a lot through your climate assessments and through your on-site audits and due diligence. And very quickly, through a gap analysis, you can understand your readiness to report against TNFD if that's something you want to do, and you'll be able to identify and close the gaps and make a start on that TNFD reporting. You don't need to have perfect data to get the ball rolling on this. You can do a lot with the information that you probably already have in your organization. So that's the first step. If you're done with the gap analysis, or you're already confident that you've got pretty good data, you can start with the locate phase. That's the first step. It's a sensitive location screening. And with this, you define the scope of what actually matters when it comes to nature within and across your asset portfolio. So I use the term sensitive location. TNFD defines this as something quite specific. It's a site that's under protected status, a protected area, a site which has high biodiversity or ecosystem importance, a site which is highly degraded, a site which could have high baseline water stress, or it's close to important resources for communities. So if your site meets any of those criteria, it really should be in scope of an assessment. And coming back to the point on interoperability, this part of the assessment ticks the boxes in your CSRD reporting, CDP, and in future, your IFRS financial reporting. So with this, you conduct a geospatial analysis. This can integrate any site-specific audit data you might have. If you're in the UK and you've got B&G reports, you can include that. And you can understand whether your assets fall into scope. And then simply you can rank and prioritize based on the likely pressures or the proximity to sensitive ecological features. This process uses the science-based target method. So you don't have any obligation to set a science-based target for nature, but this process at least gets the groundwork done in a single assessment. So to illustrate that, or what the actual output of that would be in practical terms with a case study. Here we're looking at a case study portfolio of around about 300 retail and manufacturing sites. This is an organization that conducted a TNFD LEAP assessment, including a nature scenario analysis as well. So through that TNFD LEAP process, the organization was able to, first of all, update their enterprise risk management framework. A bit of a boring thing, but it's very essential. You include nature alongside your climate risks. And on the back of that, they were able to engage a wider range of stakeholders within the business to identify specific business cases to address nature-related risks. Secondly, they defined specific assets in sensitive locations, and they set targets that were impact and financially material. So in this case, what the organization focused on was setting water reduction targets, a direct cost benefit, but also an impact and a risk mitigation because some of the assets were in high water stress locations, and that was flagged as a long-term risk. So water reduction targets and technical interventions help to mitigate that. And thirdly, they identified specific sites where biodiversity, talking about species and habitats, could be enhanced. And this was done through a series of practical measures. Some of those have been implemented already, and some of them are in the planning. And this includes things like directional lighting to mitigate impacts on nearby sensitive species, implementation of green roofs to create a green space and a well-being boost for the workforce. And for factory sites, where there was major physical climate risks, there were landscape scale partnerships that are looking into with the objectives to create and to restore wetland, which provide long-term, we're talking 50-year plus long-term resilience against flood mitigation. And this also provided a green outdoor space as well for workers and for the local community. So TNFD is a widely adopted tool, but it's far from the only regulatory driver. It's just the framework that everybody uses. So nature regulation itself has been accelerating very quickly, and a lot of it's happened in the background. Most people don't know that many of these rules and regulations have come into place or are coming into force. So over the past few years, we've seen foundations laid. The Global Biodiversity Framework, 2022, TNFD in 2023, EU regulations from 2024 until today, which are bringing biodiversity formally into mandatory reporting. And in the UK context, we've had biodiversity net gain. This year, NSIPs are going to be in scope of that. But the biggest shift, arguably, for asset managers and investors is going to happen towards the end of 2026 and the start of 2027. And that's because IFRS, I'm calling it S3. It could be called something else, but it's going to be probably S3. IFRS S3 will include biodiversity related standards. We expect to see a draft for that coming in October this year at COP. And this is the moment that nature really becomes integrated into mainstream financial reporting. TNFD is a completely mandatory thing, but IFRS is going to be a de facto mandatory for companies where it's adopted within the jurisdiction. So for asset owners, it means that nature impacts and dependencies will need to be accounted for with the same rigor as financial materiality, risk, and performance today for climate. So we're moving from a fragmented nature policy to something which is going to be much more globally consistent with a bit of an accounting treatment to it as well. So with IFRS entering this space, it's the clearest signal we've had actually that biodiversity is no longer an ESG add-on, but it's going to become a core part of the financial reporting backbone.
And just to add there, even if you aren't or expected to be captured within IFRS initially, what we do expect to see is that it will trickle through. So the investors at the upper end who are obligated will be pushing through those requirements to their investment managers to be able to allow them to align or comply, let's say, with that too. IFRS really, it really introduces a much more rigorous way in which biodiversity is going to be disclosed. And like Tom was saying, it's going to it's looking to integrate biodiversity front and center into financial decision making too. I think Tom, I saw you put up GRESB. So GRESB, for those of you who do it, you'll be familiar that GRESB introduced a question last year for the first time on biodiversity and nature-related strategy. It's quite a loose question at the moment. It does require evidence. It's not scored. And the way we're seeing clients answer that is, there's a wide spectrum. Those who are aligning with TNFD obviously be very much easier for those to do, but many of our clients are simply on a journey and they're just, some of them are only thinking about screening their portfolios to identify opportunities of where there's assets at risk. How we see this evolving is, so GRESB themselves have already indicated that they are moving towards a performance-centric based scoring model. Carbon is going to come, energy and carbon will come first by 2028, and they then are assessing the other topics. So resilience being one, but also biodiversity is on their radar. And how or when, we don't have a timeline. What we can expect, it'll be probably the end of this decade, by the time GRESB are indicating when it'll be introduced. And the reason for that is that there isn't currently a convergence in the market around how performance is measured. Whilst we do have biodiversity net gain here in the UK, GRESB is a global standard and they are looking for global metrics that have been adopted across the market and are universally accepted so that what good looks like is understood and can be demonstrated too. So not scored at the moment, but for those of my clients who look for whom GRESB is important, they are already ahead of the curve in addressing how they can integrate sustainability into their investment strategies too. I think Tom has also mentioned SFDR at 1.2, whilst this is more mandatory reporting. SFDR, it would be remiss of me not to mention that SFDR characteristics very much can look at biodiversity. So particularly your Article 8 and your Article 9 funds. Article 8 funds that need to promote an environmental characteristic, linking that to a biodiversity um, goal, very much can be something that will sit very comfortably within that too. So we were just going to have a little bit of a chat between us around some of the ways in which we see our own clients. Not everyone is going to be ready to jump into TNFD. It's a fantastic framework to allow clients and asset owners make that journey towards adopting in a more rigorous and structured way. How do they consider and integrate nature-related risks and opportunities in their decision making and strategies? But that's not the case for many clients as well. Some of them are only thinking about screening, or some of them want to do asset-specific opportunity improvements too. Tom, I really liked the one that you had on a picture there of the lighting, the down lighting at the industrial estate, and to reduce light pollution. That it would is one that'd be off. It is a very simple one to do. You're going to have lighting outside, have it as a downlight rather than an ambient light across the whole. Things like that, I think, are very cheap, low cost opportunities.
Yeah, that was a really interesting one actually, and that was I'm trying to think of the project. It was in the Netherlands, I think. There were a few sites, Netherlands and Poland, where we saw that, and actually in that instance, you think it's a fairly small intervention where all you have to do is put a
Mm,
shutter over the windows of a factory or put directional lighting in. In these particular instances, the factory was only a few hundred yards away from a Ramsar wetland. But because it wasn't directly in the boundary of the operational site, there had never been anything done about it. But the impact reduction by doing that on there was a species of local bats, which
yeah,
was substantial. And for the business, that was something that they could talk about as well. They could get some reputational and local engagement, reputational benefits and local stakeholder engagement with those actions. So it was a good thing for them. It didn't cost them very much to implement it. It's
mm,
like very, very small scale actions that you can take. And then on the flip side of that, you've got some asset managers who are looking at full landscape scale interventions. I mean, this is the total other end of the spectrum. I mentioned that also in one of the case studies where you might have assets that are in very, high risk flood prone areas. What can you do about that? There's only so much mitigation you can put in at the doors to stop water coming in. Ultimately you need landscape level initiatives, and that needs engagement with other stakeholders and government. So it's a much more difficult ask. But the range of activities that can be undertaken for risk mitigation are substantial.
yeah. And combining with other objectives around health and well-being, for instance, I've seen a great example recently at an industrial asset where they had to have a flood attenuation pond by the very nature of the asset. They converted it or upgraded it, let's say, to a wildlife pond, put some lovely seating around it, so there's a space for people at the industrial sites to actually come out during the day, and very little cost actually, but building on a feature that was already had to be at that particular location.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for the multiple benefits for these kind of interventions. There was a point you mentioned earlier about cost efficiencies from
Mm.
green roofs. So you can reduce your ambient temperatures in the building, so your energy costs are less. Um, what I've seen some good examples of, particularly in data centers, actually, I think these were some examples in Malaysia. There was actually full habitat creation around the data center. So we're talking construction of forests on the edge of it, not just a green roof, but bringing down completely the temperature around the asset. So you're not just relying on a green roof, but you're actually having an entire habitat that
Shading,
people can walk through. You're shading the building, but it makes it more accessible for or more bearable for people as well. In certain places where you have these assets, it's very hot and it's getting hotter. So you're not only looking at temperature reductions for cost efficiencies, but you have to make the temperature bearable for people who are walking, to and from the car park. Just simple
Yeah.
interventions like this.
Yeah, so it's ticking the health and well-being box, the energy performance box, and also
Yeah,
the nature box as well.
yeah,
And and different asset types will lend themselves to different initiatives. Industrials are will have a lot of flexible space outside to be able to allocate to wildflower meadows, what have you, or equally, in an urban environment where you would think you'll be reduced opportunities, I'm sure. Um, Beehives, I know we were talking about before the call
mm,
around, we often see beehives being promoted on roofs, but actually they don't really do very much, do they, for the wild bees, and in fact actually just increase cultivated bees who who are fighting for the same sort of food source really as the wild bee species.
yeah. I think with urban assets,
Very topical one.
you have to be quite careful with the type of interventions at urban sites. It can be very easy to do some things that on paper, sound nice, but you should probably consult with an ecologist to make sure that you're doing the right thing and that your intervention stands the test of time as well. It's not just something that lasts a couple of years, but it's something that has cumulative benefit over, 15 or 20 years. These things will at some point be measured and monitored as well. We already have it with biodiversity net gain in the UK, and there will be similar frameworks popping up across Europe. So it's prudent to be ready for these things.
Hmm. I see there's some questions in the Q&A. There's one there which I don't actually know this. What's a Ramsar wetland, Paul? There's
Ram
clearly lots to learn here.
yeah, yeah, a Ramsar site, RAMSAR is a type of protected area. Um, there's the various different classifications of protected areas, but this is what the TNFD sensitive location screening looks for. It sees where your asset is potentially within or very near to any classification of protected site. And depending what that site is, there might be different types of interventions that you have to take. I'm happy to share a bit more information about sensitive sites after the fact.
Hmm. Can you share more examples of where real asset owners have turned biodiversity risk into opportunity for value creation? So maybe that was before our chat that we were having there. Um, is
Did that
anything else to
question just
add?
disappear?
It did. And how do you see biodiversity risk translating to financial risk for real asset portfolios within the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think that's quite real. Biodiversity risk is already known to be a systemic risk. So there was a national security assessment from the UK government recently, and they basically identified that biodiversity loss is a risk to national security. You had the year before, 2024, I think the Green Finance Institute came out with a paper that said that if we have a collapse of ecosystems in the UK, the GDP impacts are going to be worse than the 2008 crisis and COVID. Um, and there's already a regulatory cost actually in the form of BNG in the UK. So that's already happening. The regulation to
Mm,
address biodiversity loss is already a cost to developers. A single BNG unit can be tens of thousands of pounds. I've just seen what's BNG in the chat. BNG, biodiversity net gain, which is the mandatory requirement for developers in the UK to achieve 10% uplift in baseline biodiversity. So you have to do a baseline assessment done by an ecologist, and then you have to achieve a 10% increase in biodiversity within a set time at that asset. And if you can't do it at the asset, you have to buy a credit offsite. So that's already a regulatory cost. That's in the UK. It hasn't happened in Europe yet, but it probably will. Europe's got a nature restoration law, which has got a really ambitious target where they want to restore 20% of degraded land by 2030 and 100% of degraded ecosystems by 2050, which is
wow.
which is a phenomenal target. Whether they'll achieve it or
Yeah.
not is a is another question, but I would not be surprised to see an equivalent to the UK biodiversity net gain popping up in Europe, potentially in France, Netherlands, Germany, where they're already quite ambitious on these kind of projects.
Hmm. How do you tie biodiversity initiatives to value creation or return on investment? How can you sell this to fund asset managers? Maybe I
Hmm.
might just take this one initially. Very much linking that to fiduciary duty. Does the fund and asset managers have a fiduciary duty to manage risks, of which it sounds like biodiversity is there or soon to be very much a risk to that. Um, uh, and it sounds like acting on nature-related risks and opportunities should be able to help and preserve those long-term returns, potentially avoid brown discounts, but also allow buildings to um, position themselves for a green premium as well, if those are available, particularly in challenging markets where you need to be differentiating your assets from one to the other too. Do you have anything you think Tom, that could add to that? Or and how do you sell that business case to fund managers?
I mean, what we've actually been having a number of discussions on recently with clients is on the case for science-based targets for nature and particularly uh, water reduction targets. This water reduction, many people think of water as completely separate to biodiversity, but it's not. It's very all-encompassing. Um, Science-based targets for water reduction have a very clear cost-benefit case if you're investing in something, whether it's a landscape scale intervention or whether it's a technological solution, and you're spending less on water over the long term, and you're mitigating the risk of drought and lack of water availability. That's a strong business case. We've been talking to uh, to companies recently where their forecast losses or forecast costs, let's say, their increase in OpEx if they have to import water to certain sites is in excess of £2 million a year. So by getting ahead of those risks and avoiding them completely, there's a very clear ROI on that.
We've got time for one more question. The biodiversity net gain credits, are they increasing cost? Are they set? Are they expected to rise?
Um, depends how many you need to buy. They are going up. They're quite expensive. I've it, it- some of them are in the region of 10 to 20,000 pounds. It's difficult to say exactly. It's quite case dependent. It's not a huge market at the moment. But what we've seen is a huge increase in the number of habitat banks that are making these available. So we should expect to see the supply for those increase, which would, in theory, drive the cost down, but remains to be seen.
Yeah. Oh, we're seeing two more that have come
Yeah,
in. So
Paul
one on
maybe.
SFDR, which I might take. So I know biodiversity is one of SFDR PIIs. You see as being used, perhaps occasionally as a differentiator for LPs. When we work with, we work with many clients who we support on SFDR. Yes, biodiversity is one of the voluntary PAIs. It's not one that we commonly see adopted by clients with real assets. It's a challenging one to respond on. You need to understand your available space that can literally, you're talking about measuring walls, roofs, everything that is available that can be a vegetated surface. Where we more commonly see it coming up in SFDR are commitments as a characteristic of the fund. So making a biodiversity commitment to improving the land management or not adversely impacting biodiversity of an asset, and then with a numerical quantitative target associated with that. We would caution looking at the biodiversity PAI simply it just simply can be challenging, not for everyone, but it can be challenging to respond to that particular PAI for real assets.
Mm. Just to add, we've seen that adopted, but by timberland asset managers or agricultural asset managers, but
Mm.
the level of data that you need to collect to confidently respond to that is tremendous, and it's quite an expense to actually collect the necessary
It
data.
is. It is, and it's just so difficult for buildings, particularly when, other ones are around carbon and other metrics that you will are pretty much more bread and butter to be able to report upon. Okay, I think that brings us to a close. If there's any questions that we haven't responded to, we'll certainly look to answer when we send you around the slides. But thank you very much for your time, and we are very much welcome if you want to come back with any questions or want to pick up any particular points that you find interesting to catch up with us on.